testified to yesterday was how you can't rely on the oxygen levels because it's the carbon monoxide binds to the oxygen and it can give a false reading. You need this hypoxy testing, the hypoxy oxygen testing. So the bottom line is that this is information that has been within the state's control. The state has had ample notice that this could have played a part of Dr. Fowler's testimony. It is incredibly prejudicial to the defense at this point now, after Dr. Fowler has testified and left the state, to bring forth evidence. Again, the jury being the trier of the fact, Dr. Fowler was pretty clear. He was not saying that this was the cause of death. He's simply opining that it wasn't considered by the state. And apparently it was considered to be a ridiculous concept by the state of Minnesota that they didn't think to test it. Since this trial has started, in addition to this new evidence, the state has had multiple conversations with a city employee about the vehicle itself. They've gone and taken pictures of the vehicle. Again, all of this they've had ample opportunity to do, but this is what they're doing in the middle of trial, even though they've known for a long time that this was an issue. I did receive also last evening a summary of Dr. Tobin's anticipated rebuttal points that 3 of the 4 points I do not see as proper rebuttal, but we can address that later.
Well, let's address that now, as long as I'll ask the state to respond to something other than your carbon monoxide issue.
Yep. So last night I received a one-page memorandum referencing a conference that they had with Dr. Tobin. It's date stamp 50417. They identify 4 areas of potential rebuttal. The first being that Dr. Tobin will testify regarding the significance of the hypoxic changes from a physiology and clinical standpoint, including his conclusion that the anoxic seizure is not indicative of a primary cardiac event based on the timeline of significant events. I believe that Dr. Tobin has already extensively testified as to his opinion of the significance of the anoxic seizure. I mean, that formed a large basis of his testimony and how he concluded that. Now, the fact that there is a differing opinion that it's a cardiac event instead of a hypoxic event that's the nature. Again, state has had ample notice. It's not rebutting. It's just simply reintroducing what Dr. Tobin has already testified to extensively.
Well, my recollection of Dr. Fowler's testimony is that he agreed that it's a hypoxic reaction, but it's just the mechanism. I think we're talking about the mechanism. Was it due to positional asphyxia versus cardiac arrhythmia? But I think they all agreed that it was a myoclonic seizure as a reaction to hypoxia.
Agreed, Your Honor, but the mechanism being the point of what Dr. Tobin has already extensively testified to. Right. And the fact that Dr. Fowler had a different opinion, this is not proper rebuttal because it's already been testified to at length. What the mechanism of the seizure has already been opined by Dr. Tobin.
Okay.
The second area that Dr. Tobin has indicated is he said Dr. Tobin will testify regarding the scientific research supportive of his analysis that showed how the hypopharynx can be narrowed. Again, I believe that he has already extensively testified to his position as to the narrowing of the hypopharynx. Whatever this additional research is, I have been provided with a single journal article relevant to the treatment of COVID patients that was provided to me last night as well. If it's limited to that single article, I guess that could be construed to be additional evidence, but again, Dr. Tobin extensively testified as to his view of the narrowing of the hypopharynx. The third area is what is written as follows. Dr. Tobin has reviewed and will testify as to his analysis of the 2 studies of that Dr. Fowler cited regarding outdoor exposure to carbon monoxide. Dr. Fowler testified that Mr. Floyd could have had a level of 10 to 18% carboxyhemoglobin as reflected in the slides disclosed on 4/13, and that in his opinion this level could have contributed to Mr. Floyd's cardiac-induced death. Dr. Tobin will rebut this analysis and provide his opinion that based on lab tests done at the emergency department, Dr. Fowler's analysis does not hold. So this email being sent at 4:53 p.m. last night, or approximately 5 o'clock last night, suggests that Dr. Tobin may have seen these test results, or the test results done at the emergency. There's no indication, is it these new test results or is it some other test result? Nevertheless, it's our position that these new test results should not go in front of the jury, first and foremost. And second, if they were, I would be moving for a mistrial based on this, because again, the state has had ample notice. Finally, Your Honor, the fourth paragraph reads, in his report regarding the size of Mr. Floyd's heart, Dr. Fowler cited 2 studies, the Molina and DeMaio study and the Northwestern study from 2021. However, Dr. Fowler did not cite the Mayo study that he referenced in direct examination, and he did not offer the opinion that Mr. Floyd had an enlarged heart. Dr. Tobin will clarify the facts underlying these studies and their application to Mr. Floyd. Again, this is the very nature of our system, right? There's an opinion and there's a counter opinion that we both, Dr. Tobin has already cited this study. He has talked about this study. He acknowledged the existence of the other studies. So this is not proper rebuttal because it's already been testified to. They're trying to recreate and get Dr. Tobin in front of the jury again to talk about things he's already talked about. The CO2, fair enough, right, to some limited extent based upon, Dr. Fowler's testimony.
All right. Mr. Blackwell, let's talk about those other, aside from the lab tests, those 4 points that the state is seeking to present rebuttal.
Obviously, Your Honor, we wouldn't be having any of these discussions this morning had there not been new opinions from Dr. Fowler raised from the stand. And one of those new opinions, and one which I think I was objecting to at the time, was his discussion of the Mayo study. This had to do with the whole issue of the enlarged heart, the cardiomegaly. And he had disclosed to us his reliance on Molina and DeMaio, and also the Northwestern study. That was in his report. And as Your Honor well knows, the whole point of having reports and disclosures for both sides is so that both sides have notice for what's going to be testified to on the stand. So he testified about the Mayo study anyway. He expressed his opinions about the Mayo study. It was a free kick at the goal because we didn't know that he was going there.
And what study again? Could you spell that one? Because I'm mixing up DeMaio and...
Yeah, the Mayo study is M-A-Y-O. It's as though it should be pronounced Mayo. Okay. And what Dr. Tobin would talk about would be that particular study and the fact that in the opinions that Dr. Fowler had presented in his report, he didn't offer the opinion that Mr. Floyd had an enlarged heart. He offered it from the stand. He didn't offer it in his report. And had we known at the time from the disclosures that that's what he was going to testify to, then we would have addressed it during his testimony, during his direct, when he was here before.
Well, let me ask you, so what specifically do you want Dr. Tobin to testify to regarding an enlarged heart?
He will simply testify that if you then look at the overall studies, including the Mayo study that we've been talking about, that Mr. Floyd's heart weight does not fall within a range that is abnormal. So he'll talk about the broader sort of pool of studies in the framework of discussing the Mayo study that we had learned about, at least that Dr. Fowler was going to rely on in his testimony.
I guess one question I have is, he's the pulmonologist, he's not the cardiologist. Are you recalling your cardiologist to talk about the enlarged heart and give an opinion about an enlarged heart?
No, Your Honor, just the pulmonologist.
Okay.
And obviously there's a cardiopulmonary system, and they both kind of operate kind of hand in glove. So we felt, frankly, in the interest and respect in Your Honor's admonition, that we try to be focused substantively and temporally, to simply call one person to talk about this and not multiple ones.
All right. Okay. What about the other?
On the issue of the hypoxia, for the first time from the stand, we heard from Dr. Fowler that an anoxic seizure was evidence of a primary cardiac event. Your Honor is right in what Your Honor had understood, that both sides do understand kind of what happens when you have an hypoxia event and how one passes away. What we had not heard was Dr. Fowler attributing it to a primary cardiac event. That was not in this report, and it was disclosed for the first time from the stand. And as well as relates to the hypopharynx, that was crystal clear from the stand, that Dr. Fowler said, having heard Dr. Chauvin testify, I went out to canvass the literature and I found nothing there supportive of his theories for somebody who has studied the science of breathing for 46 years. So what Dr. Fowler would testify there is what is the nature of the research in that respect, in direct response to the new statement from Dr. Fowler from the stand.
Let's talk about the opinion regarding the carbon monoxide effect and Dr. Tobin's opinion, which would appear to be within the scope of his expertise as a pulmonologist. But is it going to be solely talking about the lab tests?
It is solely talking about the carbon monoxide content of his blood, Your Honor, and I don't want to try to answer the court's question as clearly as I can.
No, go ahead.
It isn't just talking about the test results. The test results are subsumed in it, but the bottom line of what he's talking about is what is the evidence as to whether or not the carboxyhemoglobin content, the carbon monoxide content of his blood, could have been in the range of up to 15%. And he's saying that based upon the medical evidence available, that was available to everybody, looking purely at the oxygen.
What was available to everybody?
The oxygen saturation content of his blood.
Okay.
And contrary to counsel's comment on the science, the way that the oxygen saturation works, we have hemoglobin, so either the oxygen is going to combine with the hemoglobin or carbon monoxide will. And if carbon monoxide has bound to it, then you can't have an oxygen saturation of 98%.
No, I understood the testimony.
So that is what he would speak to. The test results are merely corroborative of that, because the test results show a specific testing for carbon monoxide itself, and it isn't simply derived from looking at the oxygen saturation content, which is at 98%, and therefore the most carbon monoxide could have been is 2%. So it is addressing the same issue from the two different perspectives: oxygen saturation versus actual testing in the test results of the carbon monoxide itself.
Well, I agree with you that if the tests had been disclosed earlier before Dr. Fowler testified, there'd be no problem with putting that in his rebuttal. Probably there would have been no need, because Dr. Fowler would have been advised of the results and testified accordingly. So there would have been no need for rebuttal. So, but other than that, so are those the four topics, though? Did counsel set those out pretty clearly?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. All right. First of all, in dealing with these lab test results, I find that Dr. Fowler's report gave sufficient notice to the state that the carbon monoxide that potentially was in George Floyd's blood could have affected cause of death. I read page 15 of his report, which I don't have at my fingertips at this point, that basically they said it, Dr. Fowler came right out and said it should be tested. That gave the state notice with sufficient time in February to either test the samples that are still there or to dig a little deeper. It's just by serendipity that Dr. Baker calls the state and says, oh, by the way, it does exist. It should be in there. It seems to me very odd. I'm not claiming any bad faith on the state's part, but it seems odd that Hennepin County Medical Center, when they're asked to turn over all their records, that they don't include records that maybe are just buried a little deeper. I think their response to the subpoena was probably insufficient in and of itself. And they should check their standard operating procedures so that in the event this happens again, that they will supply all the information they have. But in any case, the defense gave notice that this was going to be an issue and specifically talked about testing the sample. The state had sufficient time to investigate and disclose to, even if it's just because Dr. Baker called the state and said, we can actually find this, at 8 o'clock this morning, when the state is, or the defense expert is done testifying, has left the state, it's untimely to give the notice, and it prejudiced the defense by the late disclosure, even if it's not due to bad faith. But the late disclosure has prejudiced the defense. It's not going to be allowed. So Dr. Chauvin will not be allowed to testify as to those lab results. If there's anything he wished to add about carbon monoxide as far as environmental factors, but if he even hints that there are test results that the jury has not heard about, it's going to be a mistrial. Pure and simple. This late disclosure is not the way we should be operating here. In that case, Dr. Chauvin may testify as to carbon monoxide if he sticks to the environmental factors, and as a pulmonologist looking at the videos, for example, and seeing Mr. Floyd's location and not knowing whether the vehicle is even on or not, which the state brought out in cross-examination. All those factors he can talk about environmentally and what the likelihood is that it would affect his carbon monoxide concentration in Mr. Floyd's blood, that's fine. But nothing about these lab test results that were just disclosed 8 a.m. this morning after the defense expert is done. With regard to the DeMaio, I will allow I have a little concern that we're having a pulmonologist opine whether it's an enlarged heart or not. But given his background, which, as I think Mr. Blackwell appropriately stated, is a cardiopulmonary system, it is a system, and I think he has some expertise in the function of the heart and its relation to the lungs. And so I think it is appropriate that he be allowed to opine whether or not the heart was enlarged or not, based on those studies, and specifically responding to those studies. As far as the scientific research, the defense did bring up as a new issue whether or not narrowing of the hypopharynx is supported in literature, and Dr. Fowler said he did a check and he didn't find anything. I think it is permissible that Dr. Chauvin be allowed to come and say, since then, since Dr. Fowler's testimony, he has done his own search, or he relied on this, and there is literature, and he can talk about the literature in a summary fashion. With regard to the hypoxic seizure, it was pretty clear from Dr. Chauvin's testimony that he had an opinion that there were movements of George Floyd's legs, that those were myoclonic or anoxic seizures due to the lack of oxygen. Dr. Fowler did not really dispute that. He also indicated that it was a lack of oxygen to the brain that causes such seizures. The only difference between the two was the mechanism. Did the lack of oxygen, was that caused by positional asphyxia versus cardiac arrhythmia? And as I recall, Dr. Chauvin excluded cardiac arrhythmia or a cardiac event as the cause of the lack of oxygen. Since he has excluded a cardiac event as the cause of the lack of oxygen, that evidence is already in the record. I don't have to remind both sides that the purpose of rebuttal evidence is not to restate what has already been testified to. It's to bring up new evidence to rebut something that came up in the other side's case. Accordingly, as to the hypoxic seizure, that's not going to be allowed. The scientific research supporting hypopharynx narrowing will be allowed. The lab tests are not allowed to be discussed, but Dr. Chauvin can talk about carbon monoxide and the likelihood of a high carbon monoxide reading based on environmental factors if he wishes, because that was gone into a great extent. And finally, the reports, and he may opine whether, in his opinion, George Floyd's heart was enlarged or not. Do we have pretty much the ground rules set?
Just one question for clarification on the carbon monoxide. There were test results that existed before the ones that are at issue from last night / this morning. What Dr. Tobin, these are the ones that relate to the oxygen saturation. So that was known before last night. And so I haven't talked to Dr. Tobin this morning about what he's going to say or when. I might ask the court for a few minutes before we start. But what he was able to come to last night without saying anything at all related to these test results at issue was we had the results already, both sides do, on the oxygen saturation in his blood from May 25th, 2020.
Well, let me ask you this. Is his opinion going to be that when the oxygen saturation levels are this high, that precludes high CO, because a high carbon monoxide reading would depress the saturated oxygen?
That's correct. They are would be inversely related. So a high oxygen saturation
would indicate a low carbon monoxide.
Yes.
Mr. Nelson?
As I understood Dr. Fowler's testimony, at lower levels of carbon monoxide, because the pulse oximeter does not, it's not going to differentiate based on the color of the blood between oxygen and carbon monoxide.
This is the bright cherry red testimony.
Correct.
I think that's appropriate cross, but I think if that is in fact Dr. Tobin's opinion that these oxygen saturation readings, which have been disclosed earlier, would indicate a low carbon monoxide reading because they are inversely proportional, and it's appropriate, however, to say those readings are based on pulse ox, color of the blood, color of the fingernail, and the bright cherry red, essentially confronting him with that testimony, I think is appropriate cross, but it does not preclude the state from recalling Dr. Tobin for that purpose.
Yep, that's the clarification, Your Honor.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, that would be permitted. All right, anything else before? And you want a few minutes to talk to Dr. Chauvin?
If I may, Your Honor.
Why don't we start up at 10 o'clock? I assume he's close by. You could do it quickly, Mr. Blackwell.
I was hoping for a few more minutes.
I think since the defense is going to rest and you'll proceed directly to Dr. Tobin, are we calling anybody else?
No one else, Your Honor, and if we could have to 10:15.
10:15 it is.
All
right, 10:15 we'll reconvene. Thank you. All right, good morning, everyone. Sorry for the delay. Mr. Nelson.
Your Honor, at this time, the defense rests.
Thank you. Mr. Blackwell, does the state have rebuttal?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
Good morning, Your Honor, counsel, ladies and gentlemen. The state will recall to the stand Dr. Martin Chauvin. In just one moment, Your Honor.
Not a problem. Dr. Chauvin, since we are recalling you, I'm going to swear you in again. Yep. Raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth and nothing but the truth?
I do.
You have a seat again. And just for the record, if you could restate your name and if you feel comfortable, take the mask off.
Okay. My name is Martin Tobin.
Mr. Blackwell.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Dr. Chauvin.
Mr. Blackwell?
Thank you for rejoining us. Got just a few follow-up questions
Yeah.
to ask you in rebuttal. But first, just so you're introduced to the jury, you're a pulmonologist,
Correct. Lung specialist. Yeah.
a critical care physician,
Yeah, intensive care doctor.
and you've studied the physiology of breathing for 46 years.
Correct. Yeah. The-
I want to first ask you about the issue of Mr. Floyd's potential exposure to carbon monoxide.
Yes.
Were you able to hear testimony regarding this yesterday?
Yes, I was.
Were you able to see this particular slide and the highlighted statement at the bottom? In 7 minutes, Mr. Floyd's carboxyhemoglobin could have increased by 10 to 18%.
Correct. Yeah, I saw that.
Would you first just tell us right off the bat, do you agree with that proposition that's highlighted there?
No, I do not.
Now, would you tell us what carboxyhemoglobin is?
Yeah. Carboxyhemoglobin is when the carbon monoxide combines with the protein in a blood that's called the hemoglobin. And so it's the combination of the carbon monoxide and that protein in the blood.
And why is carboxyhemoglobin, again, important?
It's important because when the carbon monoxide binds to the hemoglobin, it displaces the oxygen off the hemoglobin. So you need the oxygen on the hemoglobin. You don't want the carboxy, and it takes it over.
Then do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether this statement that Mr. Floyd's carboxyhemoglobin could have increased by 10 to 18% is reliable?
No, I believe it is not reliable.
Would you tell the ladies and gentlemen why that statement is not reliable?
I base it on the arterial blood gas that was obtained when Mr. Floyd was in Hennepin County.
Please, sidebar. think the objection should be sustained, but just rephrase the question.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Tobin, as you prepare to tell us why these results, in your opinion, are not reliable, could you please help the jury to understand something about oxygen saturation testing in the blood?
Right. So if you have, like was done in Mr. Floyd when he went to Henneman County, he had an arterial blood gas obtained. So that's sticking a needle into the artery at the wrist, and you take out the blood. And then on the blood gas measurements, you measure a number of different items on that, like the pressure of oxygen in the blood, the pressure of carbon dioxide, the amount of acid in the blood, called the pH, and you get all these different measurements, and you also get the oxygen saturation, and that is how much of the hemoglobin, the protein in the blood that carries the oxygen, how much of that hemoglobin is saturated with oxygen. And we know in Mr. Floyd that it was 98% saturated.
So 98% saturated with oxygen?
With oxygen when they measured it in Henneman County. And
So
that was 9/16, the time frame.
So if we know that there's an oxygen saturation of 98%, does that tell us anything whatsoever?
Yes,
about what?
I'm sorry, I interrupt. I apologize.
Does that tell us anything whatsoever about what the carbon monoxide content could have been at a maximum?
Yes, it does. It tells us that if the hemoglobin is saturated at 98%, it tells you all there was for everything else is 2%, and so the maximum amount of carbon monoxide would be 2%. It tells you the maximum amount of carboxyhemoglobin. That was what was mentioned yesterday. The maximum amount is 2%. It doesn't even tell you that it is 2%. It could be something else. But 2% of carboxyhemoglobin is within the normal range. You and I have levels of carboxyhemoglobin of somewhere between 0 and 3.
And so in other words, as to the statement that his carboxyhemoglobin could have increased by 10 to 18%, in your view, that's not possible.
It's simply wrong.
And it was at most 2%.
At most 2%.
Normal.
Which is normal.
New subject to discuss with you. You might recall, if you were listening to the testimony, my discussing with Dr. Fowler the hypopharynx.
Yes, I remember.
And you might recall I spent some time asking him about what research he had done on the potential for pressure on the back to narrow the hypopharynx.
Yeah, I recall that.
Do you recall him saying he had canvassed the literature and he could not find anything?
I'm sorry?
Do you recall him saying he had reviewed the research and that he could not find anything?
Yes, I recall him saying that.
Are you able to enlighten or give any information to the jury on the nature of the research on the hypopharynx and how it narrows with compression in the prone position?
Yeah. So, the research on this, which is extensive, is really in the scientific literature. It's in the physiological literature. And then that is applied over to clinical medicine. So the type of studies that are done are not really done in terms of ordinary clinical research. It's much more a physiological, much more scientific of how the body works. And there's about probably at least a dozen, maybe 20 studies that show the relationship between how that if you lower the size of the lungs, you must get a decrease in the size of the hypopharynx. All of the studies show that.
And then are there studies then that look at whether the pressure on the neck narrows the hypopharynx?
No. Because when we do research, we try and do research on studies that might be puzzling, that you would be kind of expecting a bit of a surprise. If you think about sticking your fingers into your neck, you know you're going to narrow the hypopharynx. That's not kind of research that somebody is going to want to do. It's so common sense that you would know that that's going to happen. I mean, you can do it on yourself if you want. And as soon as you put pressure here, you can immediately sense that your upper airway is narrowing.
Dr. Tobin, that is all we wanted to clarify with you this morning.
Okay.
If I may have 2 minutes.
Sure. Let's do a stretch break in place. There's the jury. We're going to actually have a recess now until 1:45, so we'll reconvene at that time. Still under oath, Dr. Chauvin.
Okay.
Mr. Nelson.
Just have a few follow-up questions for you, Dr. Tobin. Thank you. In terms of the carbon monoxide testing that you referenced, you would agree with me that the most common technology available in hospital laboratories for analyzing the blood is the multiple wavelength spectrophotometer, also known as the co-oximeter, correct?
Right. Yeah.
Right. Now, in terms of your testimony relevant to the research, you referenced that there were 12 to 20 studies, and correct me if I'm wrong,
Yep.
that an increase in pressure on the lungs would increase the narrowing of the hypopharynx.
Not quite.
Okay, can you just say it again?
Yeah, I mean, it is that if you decrease the size of the lungs, that you will get narrowing of the hypopharynx.
And that research would be in physiological journals?
It would be in physiological journals. There's some journals that will be a blend of physiology plus clinical. It will be, but it's primarily going to be in physiological oriented journals.
And those physiological oriented journals would be included within the general search for medical literature?
I mean, if you go into PubMed, it would be included in PubMed, yes.
And you have not produced any of those 12 to 20 articles for the state or I to review?
I mean, I listed several articles in my report of January the 27th. There's several articles in that. I can tell you them if you want to.
Specifically that stand for that proposition?
Regarding the relationship between lung volume and the hypopharynx.
Okay. I have no further questions.
Further.
No, Your Honor.
All right. Thank you, Doctor. You may step down and you are excused.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Mr. Blackwell.
Your Honor, the state of Minnesota rests.
Mr. Nelson, anything further? All right, members of the jury, the evidence is now complete for this case. Next step for you is to listen to closing arguments and then retire for deliberations. That'll occur on Monday. The attorneys and I will still be working. We have a few administrative matters and legal matters to take care of. Most importantly, going over the law that I will give you in my instructions. And that takes quite a while. And so we are not going to change our schedule. We're not going to close tomorrow. We're going to close on Monday. And so with that, remember, you will be sequestered. We have some of your questions, and we're going to try and answer as many of those as we can. I think the one thing that you need to know today as you leave is, how much do I pack? If I were you, I would plan for long and hope for short. Basically, it's up to the jury how long you deliberate, how long you need to come to a unanimous decision on any count. And so because that's entirely up to you, whether it's an hour or a week, it's entirely within your province. So that's how I would do it if I were you. We'll also give you some information probably Monday as you retire as to other questions that don't require your immediate attention. And we will also be probably giving you some hints as far as technology. We will be operating under the rules that are currently in place regarding audio and video evidence. And that is specifically that you will be provided with a laptop computer that has all the audio and video, in fact, pretty much all the exhibits in this case, on the computer, and with a large monitor to play them. You will not have to come back into the courtroom each time you want to look at the audio or video, which is the old rules, which involves a lot of back and forth. We're not going to do that. We're just going to give you that computer with the arrangements so that you can view it as you deem appropriate as part of your deliberations. So with that, I wish you a good long weekend, and we will see you Monday morning. We will convene at 9 a.m. for closing arguments and final instructions. Thank you so much. All rise for the jury. We are still on the record outside the hearing of the jury. With regard to the charge conference, I think the parties had agreed that we could do this informally off the record in chambers. Is that correct from the state? Yes, Mr. Nelson. Okay, Mr. Chauvin, you have the right to be present at all phases of the trial. That would actually include the charge conference. But basically, you'd be watching the lawyers and I wordsmithing the instructions, and I think you already have a copy. You want to be present for that, or are you willing to waive your presence?
I can waive it.
All right. We'd probably put any discussions on the record just to memorialize what we've decided, and you're willing for us to do that without you present, is that correct?
That's right.
Any requests that have already been made by the attorneys as far as proposed instructions, that constitutes a motion for me to give those instructions to the jury. So there's no need for your lawyer to object to anything, because if I don't give anything your lawyer says, that's essentially denying the motion for that proposed instruction. The same thing is true for the state. Any of their proposed instructions memorialize their request. There is no need for an additional motion objecting to whatever I decide is the final instructions. So with that, also, we have all been talking about the appropriate way to deal with questions from the jury. Occasionally, jury questions will arise. I think our preference is that we not move the jury around if we can avoid it, and also that we not have people coming and going from the government center, since you will not be required to stay here at the government center while the deliberation is occurring. Accordingly, our plan is that we do any questions by Zoom. If you recall earlier when I brought back several of the jurors who had been selected to talk about the possible effect that Minneapolis city settlement had, that's how we would do jury questions. In other words, they would be able to see us, we would be able to see them. And when I say we, I mean the parties, yourself. But the jury, because they're anonymous, would not be broadcast to the outside world. And that would be our plan for how to answer questions. Any questions that come to me from the jury, the first step is to talk to all the lawyers, get their input on how I should answer it. Very often it is rereading certain instructions, but in any case, I will talk to all the lawyers, and after talking with them, formulate what my answers are going to be. That will be on the record, but it will be by Zoom. Are you fine with that arrangement, since you don't have to be here? We would want you to be part of the Zoom, so you've got to be subject to getting in front of a computer, basically. Are you fine with that? All right. Anything else as far as before we go into the charge conference?
Not from the state, Your Honor.
Okay.
No, Your Honor.
All right. Then we are off the record until Monday at 9 a.m. Thank you.